When they voted to exclude me from Martinez and Sons Construction, I thought that was rock bottom. I thought being erased from 3 generations of family legacy was the cruelest thing they could do. But sitting in that dusty attic 6 months later, holding my grandfather's hidden letter in my trembling hands, I realized I had no idea what was really waiting for me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The boardroom felt colder that day than the December wind rattling the windows of our family's construction company headquarters in Denver. I sat at the far end of the mahogany table that my grandfather had built with his own hands in 1952, watching my uncles Miguel and Carlos exchange satisfied glances. My cousin Elena scrolled through her phone like this was just another Tuesday meeting, not the day they were about to destroy my life. Uncle Miguel cleared his throat and adjusted his expensive suit jacket. He'd always been the one who spoke for the family, the self-appointed patriarch since my grandfather passed 2 years ago. His voice carried that tone of false regret that politicians use when they're about to deliver bad news they're secretly thrilled about. "Sophia, we've made our decision about the future leadership structure of Martinez and Sons," he began, not even looking at me directly. "The family has voted, and we feel it's best if you pursue opportunities outside the company." The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest, even though I'd seen this coming for months. Ever since my father died in that construction accident, 3 years ago they'd been systematically pushing me out. First, they moved me from project management to basic administrative tasks. Then they stopped inviting me to client meetings. Finally, they relocated my office to the basement, next to the storage room that smelled like motor oil and disappointment. "Outside opportunities?" I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. "This company has my name on it. Martinez and Sons. My grandfather built this from nothing." Carlos leaned forward with that condescending smile I'd grown to hate. "Sophia, sweetie, you're not a son. The name says it all, doesn't it? Besides, construction is a man's world. You'd be happier doing something more suitable." Elena finally looked up from her phone. "We're not being mean, Sophia. We're being practical. You don't have the experience or the connections to run major projects. Dad and Uncle Carlos have been in this business their whole lives. They understand how to talk to contractors, how to handle the pressure." I wanted to scream. I wanted to remind them that I had a degree in civil engineering from Colorado State, that I'd worked on some of our biggest projects, that I'd been the one to catch the structural problems in the Morrison office building that could have cost us millions in lawsuits. But I could see in their faces that none of that mattered. To them, I was just Roberto's daughter, the girl who thought she could play in a man's game. "What about the shares my father left me?" I asked, grasping for anything that might give me leverage. Miguel pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. "Your father's shares were always meant to be held in trust until you married or reached 35. Since you're still single at 28 and frankly, given your lifestyle choices, the family feels it's best to maintain the current arrangement." My lifestyle choices. They meant the fact that I lived alone, that I dated women, that I didn't fit their idea of what a Martinez woman should be. In their minds, I was too independent, too stubborn, too unwilling to know my place. "The company will provide you with a generous severance package," Carlos added, like he was doing me a favor. "Enough to help you get started somewhere else. Maybe you could open a little design firm or something more appropriate." I looked around the room at the family photos lining the walls. Pictures of my grandfather breaking ground on his first job site, my father as a young man learning to operate heavy machinery, 3 generations of Martinez men building something that was supposed to last forever. In every single photo, the women were relegated to the background, smiling supportively while the men did the real work. But there was one photo that always caught my attention, tucked away in the corner behind my grandfather's old desk. It showed him with his arm around a young woman in work clothes, both of them covered in concrete dust and grinning at the camera. I'd asked about it once, and he'd just winked and said it was from the early days when everyone had to pitch in. Now I wondered if there was more to that story. "I need time to think about this," I said, standing up from the table. "Of course," Miguel said, though his tone suggested my thinking wouldn't change anything. "Take all the time you need, but we'll need your answer by Friday. The lawyers are already preparing the paperwork." I walked out of that boardroom feeling like I was carrying 1,000 pounds on my shoulders. The hallways that had felt like home for the past 5 years suddenly felt foreign and hostile. Employees who used to greet me warmly now looked away awkwardly, like they knew something I didn't. Or maybe they just knew which way the wind was blowing and didn't want to be associated with the losing side. My office in the basement felt like a tomb. I sat in my chair and stared at the architectural drawings scattered across my desk. Projects I'd never see completed, buildings I'd helped design but would never get credit for creating. The fluorescent light above my head buzzed like an angry wasp, and the walls seemed to close in on me with each passing minute. I thought about calling my mother, but what would I tell her? That her daughter had failed to live up to the Martinez name? That all her pride about having a daughter who could hold her own in a man's world had been misplaced? She'd worked double shifts as a nurse to help pay for my engineering degree, believing that education would be my ticket to equality in the family business. How could I tell her it hadn't been enough? The worst part was the doubt that crept in during the quiet moments. Maybe they were right. Maybe I didn't have what it took to run a construction company. Maybe I was naive to think that talent and education could overcome decades of tradition and prejudice. Maybe I should just take their severance package and start over somewhere else, somewhere I wouldn't have to carry the weight of family expectations. But then I remembered my father's voice on the day he taught me to read blueprints. I was 12 years old, sitting in his lap in this very building, and he pointed to the lines and symbols like they were magical runes that could unlock the secrets of creation. "Mija," he'd said, "these drawings aren't just paper. They're dreams, made real. Every line represents someone's vision of the future, someone's hope for building something that will last. And someday, you're going to create dreams like this too." He'd believed in me when nobody else did. He'd brought me to job sites during school breaks, teaching me to recognize quality work and spot potential problems. He'd shown me how to talk to subcontractors with respect and authority, how to read the weather patterns that could delay a project, how to balance budgets and timelines without compromising safety or quality. "Construction isn't just about being strong enough to swing a hammer," he used to say. "It's about being smart enough to see the whole picture, brave enough to make tough decisions, and stubborn enough to never give up when things get complicated." I had all of those qualities, but they didn't seem to matter to the rest of the family. To them, I would always be the daughter who thought she could do a son's job, the girl who didn't understand her place in the natural order of things. The security guard knocked on my door at 6 o'clock to let me know he was locking up the building. I gathered my personal belongings into a cardboard box, not because I was ready to leave, but because I couldn't stand the thought of coming back to this basement tomb another day. As I walked through the empty hallways toward the exit, I stopped in front of the family photo wall one more time. That picture of my grandfather with the mysterious woman seemed to be calling to me. I'd never really looked at it closely before, but now I could see something in their expressions that I'd missed. They weren't just posing for a casual snapshot. There was something purposeful about the way they stood together, something that suggested a partnership rather than just a moment of camaraderie. The woman looked familiar in a way I couldn't quite place. She had dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and wore coveralls that were clearly not just for show. Her hands were rough and calloused, and she held a set of blueprints like she knew exactly what to do with them. But what struck me most was the way my grandfather looked at her. with a respect and admiration I'd rarely seen him show anyone. I made a mental note to ask my mother about the photo, though I doubted she'd know much about my grandfather's early business partners. The family history had always been carefully curated to emphasize the masculine legacy, the father-to-son, tradition that supposedly made Martinez and Sons special. Walking to my car in the parking lot, I felt the weight of 3 generations pressing down on me. The building behind me represented everything my family had worked for, everything my grandfather had dreamed of creating, and now I was being cast out of it like a stranger, like someone who had never belonged in the first place. But as I drove home through the Denver streets, passing construction sites and half-built developments, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. Something about that photo, something about the way my grandfather used to look at me when he thought nobody else was watching, something about the pride in his voice when he taught me about the business. Maybe they could vote me out of the boardroom, but they couldn't erase the knowledge he'd given me or the passion he'd instilled in me for building things that would last. Maybe there were other ways to honor the Martinez legacy, ways that didn't depend on their approval or their narrow definition of what it meant to be family. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the darkness for a long time, staring at the house I'd bought with my first construction bonus. It was a small craftsman bungalow that I'd been slowly renovating in my spare time, learning new skills and taking pride in the work of my own hands. The irony wasn't lost on me that while my family was pushing me out of the business, I was spending my weekends doing the exact same work that had built our company's reputation. Tomorrow, I would have to start figuring out what came next, but tonight I just wanted to sit with the grief of losing something I'd always believed would be mine someday. The Martinez name meant something in this city, something built on decades of quality work and satisfied customers. Being cut off from that legacy felt like losing a piece of my identity, like being told I wasn't really who I thought I was. But, deep down, in a place my uncles and cousin couldn't touch, I knew that being a Martinez meant more than having the right chromosomes or fitting into their outdated expectations. It meant having the vision to see what could be built, the skills to make it happen, and the determination to never give up when the work got difficult. They might control the company for now, but they couldn't control the dreams my grandfather had planted in my mind, or the knowledge my father had passed down to me. Somewhere in this city, there were buildings that existed because of my work, structures that would stand long after this current family drama was forgotten. That had to count for something. That had to mean something. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough to build a new future on, one that honored the Martinez tradition in ways my uncles couldn't even imagine. The weeks that followed felt like living in a parallel universe where everything looked the same, but nothing felt real anymore. I'd wake up each morning forgetting for just a moment that I no longer had anywhere to go. Then reality would crash over me like cold water. The severance check sat unopened on my kitchen counter for 2 weeks, as if ignoring it could somehow change what had happened. My mother called every day, her voice carefully neutral as she asked how I was doing. Rosa Martinez had worked too, hard and sacrificed too much to let her emotions show easily. But I could hear the worry underneath her practical questions about job applications and future plans. She'd raised me to be strong, to fight for what I believed in, but she'd also lived through enough disappointment to know when a battle was truly lost. "Mija, maybe this is God's way of opening a new door for you," she said during one of our evening phone calls. I was sitting on my front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, trying to find some peace in the beauty of the moment. "I don't want a new door, Mom. I want the door that was always supposed to be mine." She was quiet for a long moment, and I could picture her in her small apartment, still wearing her nurse scrubs from the hospital, too tired to change but too concerned about me to rest. "Your grandfather used to say that sometimes the path we think we're supposed to take isn't the one that leads us where we need to go," she finally said. "He had his share of closed doors too, you know, more than you might realize." Something in her tone made me sit up straighter. "What do you mean?" "Oh, just the usual struggles of starting a business. nothing that matters now. But there was something evasive in her voice that made me wonder what stories she wasn't telling me. After we hung up, I found myself thinking about my grandfather more than I had since his funeral. Eduardo Martinez had been a giant in my childhood, the kind of man who seemed to fill every room he entered with his presence and his stories. He'd immigrated to Denver in 1951, with nothing but a toolbox and an unshakable belief that he could build something lasting in this new country. The stories he told were always about perseverance and hard work, about learning English by reading construction manuals and earning respect one perfectly laid foundation at a time. But now I realized there were gaps in those stories, spaces, where he'd skip ahead or change the subject when certain topics came up. I decided to visit him at the cemetery, something I hadn't done since the immediate aftermath of his death. Mount Olivet was peaceful in the late afternoon, with long shadows stretching across the neat rows of headstones. His grave was well maintained, thanks to the family's continued care, but I was surprised to see fresh flowers that looked like they'd been placed recently. "Abuelo," I said, kneeling beside the headstone, "I could really use some of your advice right now." I told him about the boardroom meeting, about the way my uncles had dismissed me like I was nothing more than an inconvenience they'd finally found a way to eliminate. I told him about the doubt that kept me awake at night, the fear that maybe they were right about me not belonging in this world. "I keep thinking about that photo in the office," I said. "The one with you and that woman. There's something about it that doesn't fit with the story they tell about you building everything alone. Who was she, Abuelo? And why do I feel like knowing her story might help me understand mine?" The wind rustled through the trees overhead, and for a moment I let myself imagine it was his voice whispering back to me. But the dead don't answer questions the living are too afraid to ask while they're still here to respond. Walking back to my car, I made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I was going to find out more about that photograph and the woman in it. If my family wanted to erase me from the Martinez legacy, maybe it was time to discover what parts of that legacy they'd already erased from themselves. The next morning, I drove to the Denver Public Library and spent hours in the local history section, searching through old newspaper archives and business directories from the 1950s. The Martinez and Sons name first appeared in the city records in 1952, but the early references were frustratingly vague. There were mentions of residential projects and small commercial buildings, but nothing that explained how a single immigrant with limited English had managed to establish himself so quickly in a competitive industry. It wasn't until I expanded my search to include Martinez Construction and Martinez Building that I found something interesting. A 1954 article in the Denver Post business section mentioned Martinez and Associates Construction Company winning a bid for a new school building in the Five Points neighborhood. Associates, not Sons. The article was brief, but it mentioned that the company was known for innovative techniques and exceptional craftsmanship, particularly in their approach to foundation work and structural engineering. Those were sophisticated skills for a one-man operation, especially for someone who was still learning the language and customs of his new country. I printed out everything I could find and spread it across a table in the library's quiet corner. The timeline was becoming clearer, but the picture was still incomplete. Somewhere between 1954 and 1960, Martinez and Associates had become Martinez and Sons, and any mention of those mysterious associates had disappeared from the public record. My phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Dad wants to know if you've made your decision about the severance package. The lawyers need an answer by tomorrow." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Tell him I need to check on something first. Give me until the end of the week." Her reply came back immediately. "Sophia, you're just making this harder on yourself. Take the money and move on." But I couldn't move on. Not yet. There were too many unanswered questions, too many pieces of the puzzle that didn't fit together. That afternoon, I drove to the Five Points neighborhood to see the school that Martinez and Associates had built 70 years ago. Jefferson Elementary was still standing, A solid brick building that had weathered decades of Denver winters and summers without showing any signs of structural weakness. The craftsmanship was evident in every detail, from the precisely mortared joints to the elegant archwork above the main entrance. This wasn't the work of a single person learning on the job. This was the result of real expertise and careful planning. I walked around the building's perimeter, noting the thoughtful placement of windows for maximum natural light and the drainage systems that had clearly been designed by someone who understood Colorado's unpredictable weather patterns. The foundation work was particularly impressive, set deep enough to handle freeze-thaw cycles, and built with the kind of precision that modern contractors rarely achieved. Standing there in the afternoon sun, I felt a connection to my grandfather that was deeper than family obligation or inherited responsibility. This building represented the same values I'd always tried to bring to my own work: attention to detail, respect for the people who would use the space, and a commitment to creating something that would last. But it also represented something else: the certainty that my grandfather hadn't built his reputation alone. Someone had taught him these advanced techniques. Someone had helped him navigate the complex world of commercial construction contracts. And someone had been skilled enough to be considered an equal partner in those early years. That evening, I called my mother again. This time, I was more direct in my questions. "Mom, what do you know about Grandpa's early business partners?" There was a pause that lasted too long. "What makes you ask about that?" "I've been doing some research, and it looks like the company wasn't always called Martinez and Sons. In the 1950s, it was Martinez and Associates. Who were the associates?" Another pause. "Mija, why are you digging into ancient history? Your grandfather built that company with his own hands and his own sweat." "I'm not questioning his work ethic, Mom. I just want to understand the whole story. There's a photo in the office of him with a woman who looks like she was more than just a casual acquaintance. And the level of expertise in his early projects suggests he had help from someone with serious skills." I heard her sigh, the sound of someone who'd been carrying a secret for too long and wasn't sure whether revealing it would help or hurt. "There are some things your grandfather asked me never to talk about," she said finally. "Family business that he thought was better left in the past." "What kind of family business?" "The complicated kind. The kind that doesn't fit with the story your uncles prefer to tell about how everything was simple and straightforward in the old days." My heart started beating faster. "Mom, I need to know. Whatever it is, it can't be worse than what's happening now." She was quiet for so long that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then, in a voice that sounded older and more tired than I'd heard before, she said, "Your grandfather had a partner in the early days. Someone who helped him learn the business and build his reputation. Someone who was every bit as responsible for the company's success as he was. What happened to them?" "Life got complicated. People made choices that seemed right at the time but looked different later on. And eventually it became easier to pretend that partnership had never existed." "Mom, who was it?" Another long pause. "Her name was Victoria Restrepo, and she was the best contractor in Denver when your grandfather was still learning which end of a hammer to hold. The pieces started falling into place so fast that I felt dizzy. The woman in the photograph, the advanced techniques in those early projects, the sudden transformation from associates to sons in the company name. What happened to her?" She fell in love with the wrong person at the wrong time, and it cost her everything she'd worked for. Your grandfather tried to protect her, but there were limits to what even he could do in those days. Is she still alive?" "I don't know. After everything fell apart, she left Denver. Your grandfather heard from her once or twice over the years, but then nothing. He always regretted how things ended, always wondered if he could have done more to help her." I closed my eyes and tried to process what I was learning. My grandfather, the man I'd always seen as a self-made success story, had actually built his empire with a female partner whose contributions had been erased from the official history. And now, 70 years later, I was being erased in exactly the same way. Mom, where would I find more information about Victoria Restrepo? Sophia, what are you planning to do? I don't know yet, but I need to understand what really happened. And I need to know if there's any record of her partnership with Grandpa, any documentation that might still exist. Be careful, Mija. Sometimes digging up the past just creates more pain for everyone involved. But I was beyond worried about creating pain. My uncles had already done that when they decided I wasn't worthy of carrying on the family tradition. Now I needed to find out if that tradition was even what they claimed it was. After we hung up, I sat in my living room surrounded by the library printouts and newspaper clippings, trying to piece together a story that had been deliberately obscured. For decades, Victoria Restrepo. The name felt significant in my mouth, like saying it out loud was bringing something back to life that had been buried for too long. I opened my laptop and started searching for any trace of her existence. Public records, business licenses, anything that might tell me who she was and what had happened to her. The search results were frustratingly sparse, but I did find a few references that confirmed she'd been a licensed contractor in Denver during the 1950s. One entry in particular caught my attention: a 1953 building permit application for a warehouse renovation in the River North District. The contractor listed was V. Restrepo Construction Services, and the permit had been filed just 3 months before the first newspaper mention of Martinez and Associates. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling, trying to imagine what it must have been like for a woman to work in construction in the 1950s. The challenges I faced in 2024 were nothing compared to what Victoria Restrepo must have encountered 70 years ago. No wonder her story had been buried. No wonder it was easier for everyone to pretend that Eduardo Martinez had built his success entirely on his own. But she had existed. She had been skilled enough to run her own company, experienced enough to teach my grandfather advanced techniques, and important enough to be considered an equal partner in the early years of Martinez and Associates. And now, as I sat in my empty house with my uncle's ultimatum hanging over my head, I realized that finding Victoria Restrepo might be more than just satisfying my curiosity about family history. It might be the key to understanding my own place in the Martinez legacy and my own path forward. The clock on my mantel chimed midnight, and I was still surrounded by papers and printouts, still searching for clues about a woman who had been systematically erased from the story my family told about itself. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had a purpose beyond just surviving my exile from Martinez and Sons. I was going to find Victoria Restrepo. I was going to learn the truth about my grandfather's early success. And maybe, just maybe, I was going to discover that the Martinez legacy was bigger and more complex than my uncles could ever imagine. The breakthrough came from the most unexpected place: my grandmother's attic. 3 days after learning about Victoria Restrepo, I was helping my mother clean out some old storage boxes when I found a manila envelope wedged behind a trunk that hadn't been moved in decades. The envelope was addressed to Eduardo Martinez in careful handwriting, with a return address from Albuquerque, New Mexico, dated 1987. Inside was a letter that made my hands shake as I read it. Dear Eduardo, I hope this letter finds you well and prosperous. I've been following Martinez and Sons in the trade publications over the years, and I'm proud to see how far you've taken our dream. I know we agreed never to contact each other again, but I'm getting older, and there are things that need to be said before it's too late. I never blamed you for what happened. You protected your family the only way you could, and I understood that even when it broke my heart. But I want you to know that those years we worked together were the best of my life. We built something beautiful, Eduardo. We proved that two people with nothing but skill and determination could create a legacy that would last. I've enclosed copies of some documents I thought you might want to have. Things that prove what we accomplished together, in case anyone ever questions the truth about those early days. I hope your sons carry on the work with the same integrity we tried to bring to every project. With lasting respect and friendship, Victoria. My mother found me sitting on the attic floor with tears streaming down my face, clutching the letter like it was made of gold. "Mija, what is it? What did you find?" I handed her the letter and watched her face change as she read it. When she finished, she sank down beside me on the dusty wooden floor. "I never knew she'd written to him," she said softly. "He never mentioned getting this letter." "Mom, what really happened between them? And don't tell me it's complicated. I need to know the truth." She looked around the attic, as if the shadows might hold the secrets she'd been keeping for so long. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Victoria Restrepo was the most talented contractor in Denver, but she was also a woman, in love with another woman in 1955. When people found out about her relationship with a schoolteacher named Margaret Chen, the backlash was swift and brutal. Clients canceled contracts overnight. Suppliers refused to work with her. The licensing board started finding problems with her permits that had never existed before. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. And Grandpa? He tried to help her. He offered to make her a silent partner, to keep her name off the public documents while still giving her a share of the profits. But Victoria was too proud for that. She said she'd rather lose everything than hide who she was. So she lost everything. Not just her business. Margaret Chen was fired from her teaching job when the school board discovered their relationship. They both had to leave Denver to find work. Victoria moved to New Mexico and started over from nothing. Your grandfather never forgave himself for not doing more to protect her. I opened the envelope wider and found the documents Victoria had mentioned. Copies of contracts and permits from the early 1950s, all bearing both Eduardo Martinez and Victoria Restrepo as equal partners. Project specifications written in her neat handwriting. Photographs of construction sites with both of them directing crews and inspecting work. But the most stunning discovery was a legal document from 1954, the original partnership agreement for Martinez and Associates Construction Company. It clearly stated that Victoria Restrepo owned 45% of the business, with Eduardo Martinez holding 55%. She hadn't just been an employee or a casual collaborator. She had been a legal co-owner of the company that became Martinez and Sons. "Mom, do you think she's still alive?" "I don't know, Mija. She would be in her 90s now if she is." I stood up, brushing dust off my jeans, my mind already racing with possibilities. "I have to find her. I have to know if she's still out there. Sophia, what are you hoping to accomplish? Even if you find her, it won't change what your uncles did to you." But I was already thinking beyond my uncles and their narrow vision of what the Martinez name should represent. Victoria Restrepo had been erased from our family history because she didn't fit the convenient narrative of masculine succession and traditional values. Just like they were trying to erase me because I didn't fit their expectations of what a Martinez woman should be. "Maybe it won't change what they did," I said. "But it might change what I do next." That evening, I began the most important research project of my life. I started with the return address on Victoria's 1987 letter, using online directories and property records to trace any connection to her name in Albuquerque. The trail was faint, but not entirely cold. I found records of a small construction company called Southwest Heritage Builders that had operated in New Mexico from 1958 to 1995, with Victoria Restrepo listed as the founder and primary contractor. The company had specialized in historic preservation and adobe construction, building a reputation for meticulous craftsmanship and cultural sensitivity. There were newspaper articles about their work on several significant restoration projects, including a 19th-century church and a traditional Pueblo community center. What struck me most was reading the descriptions of Victoria's work philosophy. She was quoted in a 1978 article as saying, "Every building tells a story about the people who created it and the people who will use it. Our job as builders is to honor both the past and the future in everything we create. It was exactly the kind of approach my grandfather had taught me, the same emphasis on legacy and purpose that had always driven my own work. I found an address for Victoria Restrepo in Santa Fe, where property records showed she'd owned a small house from 1995 until 2019. After that, the trail went cold, but at least I had a starting point. The next morning, I called in sick to my temp job at an architectural firm where I'd been working since leaving Martinez Sons and drove 4 hours south to Santa Fe. The house was a modest adobe bungalow in an older neighborhood, surrounded by a garden that showed signs of having been lovingly maintained for decades before being recently neglected. The current owner was a young couple who'd bought the property 2 years earlier. They were friendly and curious about my interest in the previous owner, and what they told me filled me with both hope and urgency. Victoria was amazing, the woman said. She must have been in her 80s when we met her, but she was still sharp as a tack. She knew every detail about this house's construction and the history of the neighborhood. She told us she'd built the addition in the back herself when she was in her 70s. Do you know where she went when she moved out? The couple exchanged glances. She mentioned something about going to live near family in Phoenix. Her great niece, I think. But we lost touch after the sale went through. I spent the rest of the day in Santa Fe, visiting the local library and historical society, trying to find more traces of Victoria's life in New Mexico. What I discovered was a woman who had rebuilt her career from scratch and created a new legacy of beautiful, meaningful work despite losing everything she'd built in Colorado. There were photographs of buildings she'd constructed or restored, each one showing the same attention to detail and cultural sensitivity that had characterized her partnership with my grandfather. She'd never married, but she'd mentored dozens of young builders and craftspeople over the decades, passing on her knowledge to a new generation. One photograph in particular took my breath away. It showed Victoria in 1985, now gray-haired but still wearing work clothes, standing with a group of young women at a construction site. The caption read, "Victoria Restrepo with participants in the Southwest Women in Construction Mentorship Program." She'd spent her later career doing exactly what I wished I could do, creating opportunities for women in construction, teaching them the skills they needed to succeed, and proving that gender had nothing to do with the ability to build something lasting and beautiful. I drove back to Denver that evening with a renewed sense of purpose. Finding Victoria had become more than just satisfying my curiosity about family history. It was about connecting with the part of my heritage that my uncles had tried to erase, the part that celebrated skill and determination over tradition and gender expectations. The next morning, I called every Restrepo in the Phoenix phone directory, asking about Victoria. Most people had never heard of her, but on my 15th call, I reached a woman named Carmen Restrepo, who paused when I mentioned Victoria's name. "Are you talking about my great-aunt Victoria, the one who used to build houses?" My heart started pounding. "Yes, that's her. Is she still alive?" "She is, but she's in assisted living now. Memory care. Some days are better than others, but she still talks about her construction days when she's having a good day." I explained who I was and why I was looking for Victoria, and Carmen agreed to meet with me. 2 days later, I was on a plane to Phoenix, carrying the manila envelope with Victoria's letter and the original partnership documents. Carmen met me at the airport, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and calloused hands that suggested she worked with them for a living. Over coffee, she told me more about Victoria's life after leaving Denver. She never talked much about her early days in Colorado, but I always sensed there was some pain there. She poured all her energy into building her new life in New Mexico. She taught me how to use tools when I was little, how to read blueprints and measure twice, cut once. Did she ever mention my grandfather, Eduardo Martinez? Carmen nodded slowly. Once, when I was in high school and complaining about some boy who'd broken my heart, she told me about a business partner she'd loved like a brother. She said he'd been caught between protecting his family and standing up for what was right, and that sometimes good people have to make impossible choices. We drove to the assisted living facility together, and Carmen warned me that Victoria's memory came and went unpredictably. Some days she was sharp and present, other days she was lost in the past or confused about where she was. But when she's lucid, she still has stories that could keep you up all night listening. The facility was pleasant and well-maintained, with gardens and common areas that felt more like a home than an institution. Victoria was sitting by a window in the main lounge, a small woman with silver hair and hands that still showed the calluses of a lifetime spent working with tools. When Carmen introduced me as Eduardo Martinez's granddaughter, Victoria's eyes sharpened with sudden focus. "Eduardo's granddaughter," she repeated, studying my face intently. "You have his eyes and his stubborn chin." I sat down beside her and carefully pulled out the manila envelope. "Victoria, I found this letter you sent to my grandfather in 1987, and I found the partnership documents you included." She looked at the letter for a long moment, and I could see memories flooding back behind her eyes. "I wondered if he ever got that letter," she said. "I wondered if he ever told his family the truth about those early days." "He didn't. My uncles have been running the company like it was always just his creation, and now they're pushing me out because they don't think a woman belongs in construction." Victoria's laugh was sharp and knowing. "Some things never change, do they? Different decade, same small minds." Over the next 2 hours, Victoria told me the story my family had never wanted me to hear. How she'd started her own company after learning construction from her father, who'd been a master carpenter in Colombia before immigrating to the United States. How she'd met my grandfather when he was struggling to land his first major contract, lacking the technical expertise to convince clients he could handle complex projects. "I taught him everything," she said with quiet pride. "Foundation work, structural engineering, how to read soil reports, and plan for drainage. He was a quick learner and a hard worker, but he didn't know enough to build anything more complicated than a basic house frame. So you became partners. Equal partners. We shook hands on it in 1952, and for 3 years we built the best buildings in Denver. We were going to expand, maybe even branch out to other cities. We had plans, dreams, a shared vision of what we could accomplish together." Her voice grew quieter. "Then Margaret and I fell in love, and everything changed. People couldn't stand the idea of a woman contractor, but they really couldn't stand the idea of a woman contractor who didn't know her place in other ways too." "What happened to the partnership agreement?" Victoria smiled, and for a moment, I could see the young woman who'd worked alongside my grandfather 70 years ago. "I still have the original, and I've been waiting a very long time for someone from the Martinez family to ask me about it." She asked Carmen to retrieve a small fireproof box from her room, and inside was a collection of documents that told the complete story of Martinez and Associates Construction Company. Partnership agreements, profit-sharing contracts, project specifications written in Victoria's handwriting, and photographs of buildings that still stood in Denver today. But the most important document was one I hadn't expected. A letter from my grandfather, written in 1955 but never sent. "Dear Victoria," it read, "I know you will never forgive me for choosing my family's future over our partnership, but I want you to know that giving up our business together was the hardest decision I ever made. You taught me that building something meaningful requires more than just skill and determination. It requires courage to stand up for what's right, even when the cost is everything you've worked for. I failed that test, and I will regret it for the rest of my life. If I could change what happened, if I could have found a way to protect both you and my family, I would do it in a heartbeat. You deserved better from me, and from this world. I hope someday you will forgive me. I hope someday my children and grandchildren will understand that the Martinez name stands for more than just masculine tradition. It stands for the belief that anyone with skill and integrity can build something that will last. You proved that every day we worked together. I pray that legacy will survive long after both of us are gone. I was crying before I finished reading, understanding finally the weight my grandfather had carried for decades. He hadn't just lost a business partner when Victoria left Denver. He'd lost his closest friend and the person who'd taught him. That building was about more than just making money or establishing a family dynasty. He never sent this letter, Victoria said gently. But he gave it to Margaret to hold, in case something ever happened to him and his family needed to know the truth. She mailed it to me after she died in 1998. I looked up at this remarkable woman who'd lost everything and rebuilt it all, who'd been erased from my family's history but had never stopped creating beautiful, meaningful work. Victoria, I need your help. My uncles are forcing me out of Martinez and Sons, and they're doing it for the same reasons people drove you out of Denver 70 years ago. But I want to honor the real Martinez legacy, the one that includes your contributions and your vision. She reached over and took my hands in hers, her grip still strong despite her age. What do you want to do, granddaughter? The word hit me like a lightning bolt, not because it was literally true, but because it felt true in every way that mattered. Victoria Restrepo had been as much a part of building the Martinez legacy as my grandfather, and that made her as much family as anyone who shared my DNA. I want to start over. I want to build something new that honors what you and my grandfather created together, something that proves the Martinez name can mean partnership and inclusion instead of exclusion and tradition. Victoria smiled, and I could see the young woman who'd refused to hide who she was, even when it cost her everything. Then let's build something beautiful together. One more time. The flight back to Denver felt different this time. I wasn't returning as the rejected granddaughter anymore, carrying the weight of family disappointment and uncertain about my future. I was coming home as Victoria Restrepo's chosen successor, carrying documents that would rewrite the Martinez family history and a vision that would honor the true legacy my grandfather had helped create. Carmen had insisted on making copies of everything before I left Phoenix. The original partnership agreement, the unsent letter, photographs of Victoria and my grandfather working side by side, and most importantly, a handwritten document Victoria had prepared during our meeting. It was a formal transfer of her remaining partnership interest in the original Martinez and Associates to me, witnessed by Carmen and 2 staff members at the assisted living facility. This won't give you legal ownership of Martinez and Sons, Victoria had explained as she signed the document with a steady hand. But it gives you something more valuable. It gives you the moral authority to carry on what we started, and the proof that the Martinez legacy belongs to more than just the men who inherited the name. I'd spent the entire flight planning my next moves. First, I would honor my uncle's deadline and give them my answer about the severance package, but it wouldn't be the answer they were expecting. Then, I would begin the process of building something new. Something that would prove that true legacy isn't about maintaining tradition, but about having the courage to evolve and grow. My phone was buzzing with messages when I landed. Elena had texted 3 times asking for my decision. Miguel had left a voicemail saying the lawyers needed my answer by noon on Friday, or they would proceed with termination procedures. Even Carlos had sent a message, unusually conciliatory, suggesting we could discuss increasing the severance amount if I was having trouble accepting the original offer. I ignored all of them and drove straight to my mother's apartment. Rosa Martinez took one look at my face and knew something fundamental had changed. I spread Victoria's documents across her kitchen table and told her everything I'd learned in Phoenix. When I finished, she sat in silence for a long time, studying the photographs of her father-in-law working alongside a woman she'd never known existed. Your grandfather carried a lot of guilt, she said finally. Now I understand why. He used to get quiet around the anniversary of the company's founding, like he was remembering something painful. I always thought it was because he missed the old country, or was thinking about how hard those early years had been. Mom, I'm going to start my own construction company. I'm going to use Victoria's partnership documents to establish my legal right to the Martinez name and legacy. And I'm going to make sure this time the story doesn't get erased. She nodded slowly, and I could see pride mixing with worry in her expression. What will you call it? I'd been thinking about that question during the entire flight home. Martinez and Associates Construction, the original name, the way it was always supposed to be. And your uncles? They can keep Martinez and Sons, but they're going to learn that they don't own the only version of our family's story. The next morning, I dressed in my best business suit and drove to the Martinez and Sons office for what I knew would be the last time as a member of the family company. The receptionist looked surprised to see me, clearly aware that my employment status was in limbo. Is there a family meeting scheduled for today? I asked. Mr. Miguel wanted to see you as soon as you came in, she said. He's in the conference room with Mr. Carlos and Elena. I walked through the hallways one final time, past the photographs of projects I'd worked on and the offices where I'd spent 5 years trying to prove I belonged. But now I realized I'd been trying to fit into someone else's vision of what the Martinez name should represent, instead of creating my own interpretation of what it could become. The conference room door was open, and I could see my uncles and cousins sitting around the same table where they'd delivered their ultimatum 3 weeks earlier. They looked confident, probably assuming I was there to accept their terms and quietly disappear from their lives. Sophia? Miguel said as I entered. I'm glad you're here. We were hoping to get this settled today so we can all move forward. I sat down at the far end of the table, just as I had during that first meeting. But this time I wasn't the supplicant hoping for their approval. I was Victoria Restrepo's partner, Eduardo Martinez's true heir, and a woman who finally understood her own worth. I have an answer for you, I said, pulling out a folder I'd prepared. But first, I want to share some information about our family history that I think you'll find interesting. I placed copies of Victoria's partnership documents on the table, watching their faces change as they realized what they were looking at. This is the original partnership agreement for Martinez and Associates Construction Company, signed by our grandfather and Victoria Restrepo in 1954. As you can see, she owned 45% of the business that eventually became Martinez and Sons. Carlos picked up one of the documents, frowning as he read it. This is ancient history, Sophia. What does this have to do with anything? It has to do with the fact that the Martinez legacy you're so proud to protect was built by a woman who was erased from our family history because she didn't fit your narrow definition of what a Martinez should be. Elena was scrolling through the photographs on her phone, looking annoyed. So Grandpa had a business partner 70 years ago. So what? That doesn't change anything about the current situation. But Miguel was studying the documents more carefully, and I could see understanding dawning in his expression. He was a lawyer by training, and he recognized the legal implications of what I was showing them. Sophia, what exactly are you trying to prove here? I pulled out Victoria's transfer document and placed it on the table. Victoria Restrepo is still alive, and she's transferred her partnership interest to me. Not just her emotional or moral claim to the Martinez legacy, but her legal interest in the intellectual property, methodologies, and reputation established by Martinez and Associates. The room went very quiet. Carlos looked confused, but Miguel and Elena were beginning to understand the potential complications I was introducing. That's ridiculous, Elena said. You can't just claim ownership of the company based on some old papers from before Dad and Uncle Carlos were even born. I'm not claiming ownership of Martinez and Sons, I said calmly. I'm claiming my right to carry on the original Martinez and Associates legacy. Victoria and I are going to rebuild what she and our grandfather started, using the methods and principles they developed together. Miguel leaned forward, his lawyer instincts fully engaged now. Sophia, whatever you think those documents prove, they don't give you any legal claim to our current business operations, our client lists, or our company name. You're absolutely right, I agreed. which is why I'm not interested in fighting you for control of Martinez and Sons. You can keep running it exactly the way you want to, with exactly the values and vision you think are appropriate. I stood up and gathered my documents. But you don't get to define what the Martinez name means anymore. You don't get to decide who's worthy of carrying on our grandfather's legacy, and you definitely don't get to erase the contributions of the women who helped build what you inherited. Carlos finally found his voice. This is insane, Sophia. You can't compete against us using our own family name. Watch me. I walked toward the door, then turned back one more time. Oh, and Uncle Miguel? You asked for my decision about the severance package. Here it is. I don't want your money. I don't want your pity. And I don't want your permission to be who I've always been meant to be. The door closed behind me with a satisfying click, and I walked out of Martinez and Sons for the last time as their rejected relative. But I was walking into something much more significant, a partnership that honored the true history of my family's legacy, and a future that would prove what was possible when talent and determination weren't limited by prejudice and tradition. The next 6 months were the most challenging and rewarding of my life. Victoria had given me more than just moral authority and legal documents. She'd connected me with a network of women in construction across the Southwest, many of whom had been her mentees or colleagues over the decades. Carmen Restrepo became my first official employee, relocating from Phoenix to Denver to serve as project manager and chief liaison with Victoria, who remained involved as much as her health allowed. Through Carmen, I met Maria Santos, a structural engineer who'd been looking for an opportunity to work with a company that valued innovation over tradition. Together, we formed the core team of the new Martinez and Associates Construction. Our first project came through an unexpected source. The same school district where Victoria and my grandfather had built Jefferson Elementary 70 years earlier. The district was planning a major renovation of the building, and someone had researched the original construction company when preparing the historical preservation requirements. When they discovered that Martinez and Associates was operating again, with direct lineage to the original builders, they invited us to submit a proposal for the renovation work. Standing in Jefferson Elementary's main hallway with Maria and Carmen, I felt the weight of history and the promise of the future converging in a single moment. This building represented everything Victoria and my grandfather had worked for: craftsmanship that lasted, innovation that served the community, and partnership that transcended the limitations others tried to impose. They built this to last, Maria said, running her hand along the brick wall. Look at these joints. Perfect consistency, no settling or cracking after 70 years. Carmen was studying the original blueprints we'd found in Victoria's files. She was way ahead of her time. These structural calculations account for seismic activity that wasn't even part of Denver building codes until the 1980s. We won. The Jefferson Elementary renovation contract, beating out 3 larger firms including Martinez and Sons. Miguel had submitted a bid, probably assuming that family connections and established relationships would give them an advantage. But our proposal demonstrated an understanding of the building's original construction that no one else could match, combined with innovative approaches to historic preservation that impressed the school board. The day we started work on Jefferson Elementary, I called Victoria to share the news. Her memory had been clearer recently, and she was following our progress with keen interest. We're back where it all started, I told her. Carmen says the original foundation work is still perfect after all these years. Of course it is, Victoria said with a laugh. Your grandfather and I never did anything halfway. Is the brickwork holding up? Every joint is still solid. The building looks exactly like it did in the photographs you showed me. There was a pause, and when Victoria spoke again, her voice was softer. Sophia, I want you to know something. When I lost everything in Denver, I thought that was the end of my story. I thought I'd failed, that all the work Eduardo and I had done together would be forgotten. It wasn't forgotten. It was just waiting for the right time to continue. No, mija. It was waiting for the right person to continue it. And that person was always going to be you. The Jefferson Elementary renovation took 8 months and became a showcase for everything Martinez and Associates represented. We preserved the historic character while adding modern safety features and energy efficiency improvements. We employed local craftspeople and maintained the highest standards of quality while staying within the school district's budget. Most importantly, we documented everything. Every technique, every innovation, every lesson learned became part of a growing knowledge base that we shared with other women-owned construction companies across the region. Victoria had taught me that knowledge should be passed on, not hoarded, and that the best way to honor a legacy was to help others build their own. The project attracted attention from architecture and construction trade publications, who were interested in the story of Martinez and Associates' return and the unique partnership between a 93-year-old pioneer and her chosen successor. The articles brought more clients, and soon we were working on projects across Colorado and New Mexico. But the most satisfying moment came when I received a call from Jefferson Elementary's principal 6 months after the renovation was completed. Ms. Martinez, I wanted to let you know that our energy costs have dropped by 40% since you finished the renovation. And the teachers say the classrooms have never been more comfortable or better lit. Whatever you and your team did, it's working beautifully. That evening, I drove to Mount Olivet Cemetery and sat beside my grandfather's grave as the sun set, behind the mountains. I'd been coming here regularly since starting Martinez and Associates, updating him on our progress and sharing the victories and challenges of building something new while honoring something old. Abuelo, we did it, I said. Victoria and I rebuilt what you started together. And this time, nobody's getting erased from the story. The wind rustled through the trees overhead, and I let myself imagine it was his voice telling me he was proud. But more than that, I could feel the presence of everyone who had contributed to this moment. Victoria's courage in the face of discrimination, my father's belief in my potential, my mother's unwavering support, and my grandfather's original vision of what was possible when skilled people worked together toward a common goal. My phone buzzed with a text message from Carmen. Just got word that the Colorado Women in Business Association wants to feature Martinez and Associates in their annual report. They're calling us a model for how to honor tradition while creating innovation. I smiled and typed back, Victoria will love hearing that. Make sure they know she's the real pioneer in this story. As I walked back to my car, I thought about my uncles and Elena, probably wondering why their former outcast was suddenly getting so much positive attention in the industry. They'd built their version of the Martinez legacy on exclusion and limitation, believing that preserving tradition meant keeping everything exactly the same. But Victoria and I had proven that true legacy wasn't about maintaining the status quo. It was about taking the best values and principles from the past and using them to build something even better for the future. Martinez and Associates Construction was thriving, but more than that, it was creating opportunities for other women in the industry. We'd established a mentorship program similar to the one Victoria had run in New Mexico, connecting experienced tradeswomen with newcomers who needed guidance and support. We'd also started a scholarship fund for young women studying construction-related fields, because Victoria had taught me that the best way to ensure lasting change was to invest in the next generation of leaders. The company that had rejected me because I wasn't a son had forced me to discover something much more powerful. I was a daughter, a granddaughter, and a partner in a legacy that was bigger and more inclusive than they could ever imagine. Standing in the cemetery parking lot, looking back at the city lights of Denver spread out below, I felt the deep satisfaction of knowing that Victoria Restrepo's name would never be erased again. Every project we completed, every woman we mentored, every innovation we shared was a testament to her contributions and a promise that this time, the story would be told completely and honestly. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new projects, and new opportunities to prove that the Martinez name could represent partnership instead of patriarchy, inclusion instead of exclusion, and progress instead of just preservation. But tonight, I was simply grateful to be exactly where I belonged, carrying forward a legacy that honored both the past and the future, building something beautiful that would last long after I was gone, and proving that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to disappear when others try to erase you. Victoria had been right about one thing. We were building something beautiful together, one more time, and this time, no one would ever be able to pretend it didn't happen. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.